Well, all right, sports fans. If you are a Minnesota Vikings fan and a Raiders fan, you're going to want to watch this video. So, we all know that the Las Vegas Raiders are going to move on from Geno Smith. It is almost a lock that they are going to draft Fernando Mendoza. However, that being said, the GM for the Raiders, John Spytek, has said that they don't want to throw the young quarterback, if they draft him, into the fire right away and destroy him. So there's a lot of rumors that maybe the Raiders just go ahead and hold on to Geno Smith, a guy who had the most interceptions in the league last year, was horrible as a starter, and the Raiders only won 2 games with him. Now, why would this interest the Minnesota Vikings? And as a Viking fan, why would you care about this? Well, because the Minnesota Vikings moved on from Sam Darnold and they went with J.J. McCarthy, who was a complete bust last year. That doesn't mean he will be a bust in the future, but they need something to spark a little bit of a competition with J.J. McCarthy. So they are looking at Geno Smith, and they're saying that Geno Smith was not utilized properly by the Las Vegas Raiders last year, and therefore they're very interested in him. If the Raiders are going to cut him, it'll save the Raiders $8 million, but they'll take an $18 million cap hit. If they trade him, especially if they can push that entire contract off onto the Minnesota Vikings, then that would be a perfect fit for the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, why would Minnesota do this? Well, if they believe that Geno Smith is a much better quarterback than what last year's performance showed, then they may be willing to make a trade. Maybe they give a 6th round draft pick to the Raiders and they take on his contract. For the Raiders, this is definitely a win. You're moving on from him either way. And Geno has indicated that he wants to move on to the free agency market in a very weak quarterback market this year and see where he can land. So he goes to Minnesota on a very cheap trade, and the Raiders get to save some money. The thing is that Minnesota traded away or they let Sam Darnold go, and Sam Darnold went and won a Super Bowl, and I think that they are regretting that. I think they learned that J.J. McCarthy is not ready for the NFL. He may need to sit another year behind a veteran quarterback. You bring in a guy who is a wily veteran like Geno Smith, and maybe you can make the playoffs. They do have a much better all-around team over there in Minnesota, and I think that given that Geno Smith would have much more success with the Minnesota Vikings this year than he did last year with the Raiders, who, well, let's face it, had the worst offensive line in the NFL. Despite having some stars on the team like Max Crosby, like Brock Bowers, and like Ashton Genty, the Raiders in the trenches are in desperate need of some serious help and some revitalization, let's say. So Sports Illustrated here goes ahead and says that moving Geno Smith to the Vikings is going to make sense. They say the most logical, realistic veteran quarterback for the Vikings could add this offseason is the guy who led the NFL in interceptions last year. He says, I know it sounds absurd on the surface, but hear me out. Geno Smith is coming off a nightmare season with the Las Vegas Raiders. There's no way around that. He's 2-13 as a starter. He threw 17 picks and 84.7 passer rating, ranked out of 36 quarterbacks with at least 200 attempts, ahead of only Cam Ward, Joe Flacco, and J.J. McCarthy and Shedeur Sanders. In making the case for why Smith would be Minnesota's guy, the first thing we're going to do is mostly throw last season out of the window. Again, I mean, it was like everybody is saying the offensive coordinator was the problem with the Raiders. The offensive line was the problem with the Raiders. They could not get anything on track, and that just put too much on Geno's shoulders, and I kind of agree with that. It's part of Smith's resume, but the context also matters. The Raiders were a train wreck last season from top to bottom. Chip Kelly was fired in November. Pete Carroll was fired in January. The Raiders' offensive line was quite possibly the worst in football. Defense is mediocre. Outside of Brock Bowers, who was hurt for a while, and Jacoby Myers, who was traded midseason, Smith's top targets were Trey Tucker and Michael Mayer. Again, nothing to say bad about Trey Tucker or Michael Mayer, but they are not superstars in the league. With all of that considered, it feels fair to give Smith something of a mulligan for 2025. He's not the kind of star quarterback who's going to overcome those circumstances. When he's on a non-awful team, as was the case when Smith was with the Seahawks quarterback in 2022 to 2024, we've seen him be quite good. That's a 3-year sample size. That is still pretty recent. I'm inclined to believe Smith isn't suddenly washed at 35 years old, but instead was dragged down by the Raiders' dysfunction. So, with that being said, I agree with this assessment 100%. I don't think Geno Smith is a terrible quarterback. I think Geno Smith is an adequate starting quarterback in the NFL as long as he is on a good team. And the Minnesota Vikings certainly fits that bill. So, should the Minnesota Vikings make this move? Well, I think that they should trade for him. I think that they should eat his salary cap. They'll probably even be able to work a deal with the Raiders where they don't even pay for the entire thing. Maybe they pay for 2/3 of it and the Raiders maybe eat $8 million. This would be a great deal for the Raiders because otherwise they're going to have an $18 million dead cap here. Now, why would they trade and not just wait for the Raiders to cut him? Well, the reason being is that if the Raiders cut him, he is now an unrestricted free agent, and the Minnesota Vikings may not end up getting him. So if you can get him for a 6th or a 7th round draft pick and you take the majority of his contract, which would appease the Las Vegas Raiders, you have now secured your veteran presence in that locker room so that you're not putting all the pressure on JJ McCarthy. So the question is, if you are a Raiders fan, I already know what your answer is. Cut him, trade him, whatever you got to do, get him off. Fernando Mendoza is absolutely the future franchise quarterback. And if we got to run with Aiden O'Connell for the first 6 or 7 games so that Fernando can slowly work his way in there, that's fine. No problem. Let's go ahead and do that. Why do that with Geno Smith when you've got Fernando lined up? Also, for the Minnesota Vikings, I think it's a perfect fit for you. I think Geno Smith will be able to come in there. I think he'll win the starting job almost right away, and he will be an adequate quarterback in your system. He fits much better in your system. It's a better offense, better weapons, better offensive line. So altogether, I think the best case scenario is if you're the Minnesota Vikings, you call up the Raiders and you say, let's make a deal. I'll give you a 6th or a 7th round draft pick. I'll take 2/3 of his salary, save you guys some money. You're going to move on from him either way. And this way, it guarantees that we here at Minnesota have him in the building. The question really remains is, what do you guys think about it? Are you a Minnesota Vikings fan, or are you a fan of another team and you want Geno Smith on your team? Drop your comments down below. Also, if you're a Raiders fan, show your love, show your support for a fellow Raiders fan, and drop those comments down below as well. Until next time, I'll see you on the next video here on Daily Rumble Sports.